Good morning. Welcome to the Boston Foundation. My name is Paul Grogan. I'm the president of the foundation, and I'm very pleased to open this Understanding Boston Forum on Preventing Homelessness Success Stories. And maybe that's an unlikely title, with homelessness to report on success stories. But I think the great news we're going to hear about this morning is that there are effective strategies for preventing homelessness in the first place. And those strategies, we have an opportunity, if we can really embrace those strategies, to, if not solve the problem, make a very, very serious dent in it. And as we all know, there's no more forceful reminder of the inequities of our society than the sight of people who are homeless or on the street in the land of plenty that this city is and that our society is. Not to mention how central the idea of having a home is to being an American and how devastating it is to be without one. So this has remained for decades, I think, one of the really unforgivable things about our society, that we just simply have not been able to cope effectively with this issue. But I think we're breaking new ground here in Massachusetts, and the Boston Foundation is proud to be among the people and organizations who are making the progress that we will hear about. The Boston Foundation, as many of you know, is Greater Boston's community foundation. We're celebrating our 90th birthday this year. We have assets of about $675 million, and the foundation and its donors make grants of about $50 million a year, mostly to Boston area nonprofit organizations working across a very broad spectrum of issues: housing and homelessness, economic development, education reform, health care, the environment, arts and culture, and so on. So our real concern is with the life and the health of this great city and this metropolitan area. And a very important part of what we do, in addition to the grant making, is to hold forums like this. The Understanding Boston program brings on a regular basis important forums and seminars on the issues and challenges of the day, supported frequently by marvelous research carried out by the foundation itself through its Indicators Project, or in association with the many think tanks and research organizations we are fortunate to have at area universities. And it's a particular pleasure that we are co-sponsoring this forum today with the Center for Social Policy at UMass, and you'll be hearing from the director of the center, Donna Haig-Friedman, later on in the program. We're very pleased to be working with them on this issue. I want to extend a special welcome to our elected officials who are here this morning. I believe, and we believe at the foundation, that we really can't solve any of the most important problems we have in the city or the region without a great partnership with our elected and public officials, who, in my view, have the toughest jobs that any of us have. So it's a matter of great satisfaction to us here at the foundation that more and more public officials at the city and the state level of government particularly are really engaged with us here at the foundation, come here on a regular basis to participate with us. And we have some very good friends here this morning, including Representative Byron Rushing. Byron, where are you? Representative Ann Paulson, Cambridge, Belmont. And my good friend, Representative Kevin Honan from Alston-Brighton. These three representatives all hold important positions of leadership in the new House, and again, I want to thank them so much for coming. And also, you'll be hearing later from John Wagner, the Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Transitional Assistance. Commissioner, we're also very pleased to have you here. The Boston Foundation has been deeply interested in housing and neighborhood revitalization since its inception, and we're very proud of the track record of this foundation, from supporting the first housing nonprofits and community development corporations that appeared in Boston, which themselves were among the first in the country. With support from the Boston Foundation and eventually many others, Boston has built a constellation of outstanding community development corporations and housing providers, and a spectrum of intermediary organizations that have really made Boston one of the premier, if not the premier, environments for innovative housing and neighborhood revitalization programs. And we see this all around in terms of the new health that has come to many neighborhoods that were in deep, deep trouble years ago. But of course, the success of the city has led to an enormous appreciation in housing prices, which is related in some ways to the issue that we are taking up today. And the foundation has moved, again, with others to try to remedy the housing supply issue across the Commonwealth. We were very pleased over the last several years to be the convener of the Commonwealth Housing Task Force, an extraordinary coalition of not only housing interests, but the business community, labor, universities, healthcare institutions that really helped redefine the housing issue in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and got major housing legislation through in the form of the 40R Smart Growth Housing Bill. I want to thank again and emphasize the tremendous role that Representative Honan played in getting that done. We're back up at the State House trying to get an improvement in that bill to make sure that it really works. But I think this is an example of if we really work together, we can get big things done. And we have to work across the whole spectrum of housing issues because we need people in every income segment to be able to afford housing. It's crucial for them, but it is also crucial for all of us in that our economy really depends more than anything else on our workforce. And if we cannot house people properly or at prices they can afford, the whole region really is going to suffer. And I've been pleased that there have been a lot of new discussion about the relationship of housing to our overall economic health. It's a very, very important breakthrough. Finally, I would just say that we are very, very pleased to be a major funder of the Homelessness Prevention Initiative, which is a 3-year, $3 million effort. We're joined in that venture by the Tufts Health Plan, the Massachusetts Medical Society, and the Star Foundation, a national foundation which is so excited about what's going on here in Boston that they have pumped major dollars into this initiative. For the past 2 years, we've funded 19 prevention programs which have been focused on a wide array of individual and families facing the prospect of losing their housing. And as we will hear, there appears to be a real success story unfolding in the timely placement of really very small amounts of money that allow individuals and families to weather the storm, to stay in their housing, and thereby prevent a very messy and unhappy experience for themselves in losing housing, and also preventing major unnecessary public expenditure. So we're very, very pleased about the apparent progress of this, but we're going to learn a lot more this morning. So again, thanks to all for being here, and it's now my pleasure to introduce our terrific Vice President for Programs, Terry Lane, who will take it from here. Terry.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everybody. I have the pleasure of sort of getting us started into the program. But before I do that, I do want to recognize some of the people who have made the Homelessness Prevention Initiative really happen. The first of these is Cindy Rizzo, who's our program officer. She's sitting right here. She's really put all the meat on the bones, and she has been joined by Hamilton Paul, also of our staff. And I also would like to recognize our partners from Tufts Health Plan, who are here in the back, and from Mass Medical Society. So all of this would not happen without all of them. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about our program this morning. We're going to begin with 2 keynotes with short presentations about research on effective homelessness prevention programs, both here in Massachusetts and across the country. And that will be followed by a panel moderated by Commissioner of the Department of Transitional Assistance, John Wagner, who's the lead staff on the Governor's Interagency Task Force on Homelessness and Housing. I also want to mention to the audience that, as you may have already noticed, this event is being recorded for the WGBH Forum Network and will be available for release through that effort. So let's get started. I'm going to, first of all, introduce Martha Burt. She's here from the Urban Institute in Washington. She will be speaking to us about HUD-funded research that she's completed on homelessness prevention, particularly including a look at individuals who have mental illness. I know that there is a write-up about her in your program, but let me just give you a few highlights of her work. She's the director of the Social Services Research Program at Urban Institute. She has a PhD in sociology, and her research and evaluation work have focused on a wide variety of populations and issues over the years. She's been a key force in thinking about homelessness for more than 15 years, and I must say that I have been aware of her leadership for a long time. It's really a pleasure to meet her in person. Her recent work includes publications called Strategies for Reducing Chronic Street Homelessness that was published in 2004, and Evaluating Continuums of Care for Homeless People published in 2002. She has another publication coming out this fall called Strategies for Preventing Homelessness, also completed for HUD. And she's working now on a study of life after transitional housing for families in 5 communities. And she completed an evaluation of family permanent supportive housing in San Francisco in 2004. So it's a pleasure I introduce Dr. Bird.
Thank you. Now, we have a little guide here. Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. Donna and I have been going back and forth on not just this meeting, but actually our 2 studies, so that we didn't go to exactly the same places and ask exactly the same questions. So we actually have a completely independent sample, except for that you went to the whole state of Minnesota as opposed to Hennepin County. I am going to sort of set the scene in terms of prevention and the issues of trying to do prevention of any variety. But I need to tell you that even though I have in fact completed the study for HUD, and even though the final report is in, the final report is not out, and I am therefore not officially speaking about this report. You've never heard me say anything about its findings. These are my opinions only and have no official blessing of anybody. So having said that, for this first bullet, I'm going to talk about ways of thinking about prevention and the context for understanding impact in terms of preventing homelessness efforts. So there are 2 schemes kind of out there for understanding prevention or classifying prevention efforts. The first of these is old and has evidently been abandoned by the public health community, which developed it to begin with, but I personally still find it valuable. And that is the idea of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So primary prevention is what we're doing, or trying to do, and that is to prevent the first instance of whatever it is. In our case, we're trying to prevent people from ever becoming homeless. Secondary prevention for us would be preventing long-term homelessness. So this would be rapid exit strategies, for instance. The first time a family comes into shelter, you do something extraordinary so they don't molder in shelter or repeat their shelter episodes. And tertiary, which we're not really going to talk about, but it was part of the original classification, is people are already deeply into whatever it is you're trying to prevent. They're chronically homeless, but by giving them housing, by giving them supportive services, you can stop them from continuing in that track. Now, there's another scheme that I tend to think of as, which is now the one in common use, which doesn't help me much at all until I tried to think about it in distinction from primary, secondary, and tertiary as how are you trying to do this prevention? And that scheme is universal, targeted, and indicated. Now, those are the first of those makes sense, but the other 2 words don't do much for me. But anyway, universal means everybody gets it. Social Security is a universal program. You don't have to, other than paying into the system, you don't have to qualify for it by being low income or anything else. For us, if we gave everybody rental assistance, regardless of income, just like we do Social Security, that would be a universal way of preventing homelessness, and it would work. It would work really well. It would use a lot of money we didn't have to use, but it would work. Targeted rental assistance, targeted is the next level down, which is you use some measure in our case, it would be people below 30% of area median income, and you give all of them rental assistance. So you're not wasting all those resources on people who actually can afford their own housing, but you are not trying to select necessarily for people who have other indicators than poverty of a risk for homelessness. Obviously, doing that does a lot of things for a lot of people. It's not just homelessness you're preventing. You're probably preventing a bunch of other things as well and supporting a lot of things. But that's the next level. Indicated is what we're all doing. We are looking at the people who are showing signs that they are at risk for homelessness, in addition to simply being poor. They're coming and knocking on our doors. They have eviction notices. They're leaving institutions without any obvious place to go, and so on. So what we're trying to do in the programs that the foundation has funded and in the programs that Center for Social Policy and we looked at is primary prevention for indicated populations. Okay. There are two different issues about trying to find prevention strategies that work, and they are effectiveness and efficiency. This is probably not a brilliant concept, but it was a way that I ended up one night having an epiphany sort of moment of trying to figure out how to talk about strategies that work, because the fundamental problem with prevention is the same as the old joke about the newspapers and the elephants. You know, you put newspapers all over the street, and somebody asks you why you're doing it, and you say to keep the elephants from coming down the street, and they say, but there aren't any elephants, and they say, see? The question is, would there have been any elephants without the newspapers? And the answer is almost always no. And every time anybody looks at prevention of anything, if you're being a scientist about it, and you have a real control group, you've done actual random assignment, the almost universal result is no difference. And so this goes for giving community-based care to prevent people from going into nursing homes. It goes for preventing homelessness. It goes for virtually anything you're trying to prevent. And the reason for that is targeting. The fact is that we give money to people who weren't seriously at risk. So the people that get the intervention and the people that don't get the intervention are not so different that, I mean, they shouldn't be different, but the fact is that the people that get the intervention have not been screened down to a level of serious risk. And let me make that actually kind of concrete for you. In the best study that we have of the risk of actual literal homelessness following receipt of an eviction notice for families, which is the New York City comparison of homeless families and welfare families that Mary Beth Shin and Beth Weitzman did a long time ago, and then followed for 5 years with an eviction notice, not the threat, not the, I think it might be time for you to leave, but with an actual eviction notice in hand, only 20% of families with an eviction notice ultimately became homeless. Okay, so using eviction, trying to predict becoming homeless when all you know is that they have an eviction notice is only going to work. I mean, if you gave everybody with an eviction notice help, only 20% of them would have become homeless without your help. So you've got to beat the 20%. And you can try to do that by targeting. So when you see these figures of 99%, 95%, whatever, didn't become homeless, they look fabulous, and they probably are fabulous, but they're not 99% of the people who would have become homeless didn't. It's 80% of the people would never become homeless even if you hadn't given them the money, and maybe 20% of them would. And so you might have improved on that. You might have prevented 3/4 of the homelessness that would have happened, but it's not the whole ball of wax that you paid for. And that's the best comparison number that I can actually give you on the probability of becoming homeless. But you really need to think about it in terms of what's your comparison? And it can push you in the direction of doing a lot more targeting. Now, one of the things that's in our report, but it's perfectly public, is an extraordinarily good family targeting scheme, family screening scheme that Hennepin County uses, which, since I don't have much time, ask me a question about it afterwards. But the other thing is, how big a difference is enough? What's considered effective? And I think this is also important to know because, is 5% difference a good one? Is 50? You have to do 50% difference to be good or whatever. On the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's website, they have a website called the Community Guide to Effective Prevention, and it has a million things up there that they have been tested and are considered scientifically documented as effective prevention strategies. When you're talking about primary prevention, like stopping smoking, with things like sales taxes on cigarettes or media campaigns and so on, 3, 4, 5% reduction in smoking initiation is considered very effective. On the other hand, if you're talking about secondary or tertiary prevention, if you're doing something for people who are already very into it, then you're looking at things like 70, 80%. So when we do permanent supportive housing for chronically homeless people and we get 80, 85% housing retention at 2 years, we're above the standard, but not by much. I mean, that's what we want to happen for something that is really at that depth of whatever. But that's not the standard for primary. Okay, and that's also important to keep in mind because people get really discouraged when they see 5, 6%, 4% differences. Okay, we of our systems that we looked at, we went to 6 places. We went to 3 for families: Hennepin County, Minnesota, which is where Minneapolis is, Montgomery County, Maryland, and the 5-county area around the 2 Kansas cities that's covered by the MAC Alliance. And we went there because they were about the only places in the country that we could find that actually had data systems that could document both the prevention assistance offered and whether people ended up in shelter afterwards, which is the 2 things that we really needed. Then we did, for serious mental illness, we came here to the Department of Mental Health and to Philadelphia, which has a similar blended system. And then we went to Denver to look at youth homelessness, which wasn't really prevention, it's really street kids. But they told us to go, so we went. And it was actually very interesting. But the systems had very important things in common, and these are themes that you'll see again as Donna talks. For Hennepin County, they had this incredible screening system. They also had one system that controlled both prevention and shelter. So the screening actually was intended to make sure that only people with multiple problems for whom money was not the only issue got into shelter. And anybody for whom money was the issue, even if they were actually literally homeless at the moment, got sent to the prevention people. Okay? And then the second thing that they did was a rapid exit program where if they let you into shelter, and believe me, the people they were letting into shelter are people that most people would put in transitional housing. Multiple problem people with histories of eviction, of drugs, of, a whole bunch of different things, mental illness, or their kids had, whatever. They were not easy people. They cut with rapid exit. They split their sheltering and they're getting them out of shelter. They thought those were conflicts of interest for one agency to do by themselves. And so they pay for shelter, one of their major motivations. They pay for shelter for families, and they pay for rapid exit, which goes to nonprofit providers, often the same ones that are doing the prevention stuff. The rapid exit service people go and meet the families within a day or 2 of their getting in to shelter, and they work out a plan for getting them out of shelter. And the families do not have any, shelter gets paid for, but they get shelter vouchers 2 and 3 days at a time. Non-compliance, no more vouchers. Now, they will cut they will slice the steps into little bitty pieces. If somebody is not, taking a big step, they'll try to make that into 5 small steps, so that some progress can be made. They don't just kick people out. But you absolutely must be working on your own salvation here. And they will, if you're not doing that, it's very, very, very rare, but if you're not doing that, you will not be sheltered. They have cut their shelter stay in half, from 60 days average to 30 days average. And the rapid exit providers also have the responsibility of 6 months support once people are in housing. This is done without vouchers. They're getting people into housing, and they're keeping them there. So the return is 12% in the 12 months after leaving shelter. With that kind of support. They would prefer to have a year's support, but HUD has told them they can't do that. Anyway, it's a very, very effective program, especially when you look at some of the data which come from Philadelphia and New York in terms of returns to shelter for families, which are at least 30% in the year after. So they've cut that at least in half, possibly in a third. In terms of and then they have extraordinarily strong collaboration that has a lot of good things for it, but not just providing services, but dreaming up new services where people that used to be arch enemies, like the legal aid and the housing court, have actually developed a mutual housing court mediation system with volunteers doing the actual mediating, a paid person doing the coordinating, that keeps 69% of their families in housing, in the original housing. They have a huge amount of work with landlords, which is absolutely essential, and we can talk about all that. They do a lot of support for landlords. Sometimes they even, well, not in Hennepin County, but there are places in the country that actually go in and clean the apartments once a week just to keep the landlords happy and keep very difficult tenants in housing and so on. In Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, since, you probably know this better than I do, but since 91 and the Special Homeless Initiative, and even before that, the department was shifting out of group home placements in the community and into more independent and semi-independent living that we think of as permanent supportive housing. It has shifted since 92 through 2004. It has more than doubled the number of community beds to over 7,000 at this point. Almost none of them are group homes. And it uses those in 3 different ways. It uses them plus the supportive services in the form of a sort of community treatment teams, clubhouses, employment programs, all kinds of different things developed over the same periods to keep people with serious mental illness in housing. Has 2 motivations for that: non-return to hospital and non-homelessness. And it uses them to help people who have become homeless get out of homelessness immediately and stay out of homelessness, secondary prevention, and it uses them for chronically homeless people, tertiary prevention. It has a lot of community-based supports. It has also done major work on its own departmental culture, which is another big issue in terms of public agencies, is for non-housing public agencies to accept the fact that housing is part of their responsibility of their mission. In DMH terms, that would be housing as a clinical issue. In child welfare terms, that would mean housing is a protective issue, and so on. You can spell that out for yourselves. So prevention can be cost effective with careful targeting, with political recognition and acceptance of multiple goals. So when I was saying you could only prevent, there's only 20% that would become homeless without your help of the normal family, rent, mortgage, utility kind of thing. There are many other things that will happen for that other 80% that you're giving money to. You may stabilize them. They may not move in with other people. The more you can keep kids going to the same school and in the same house, the better it is for the kids. Multiple moves for children are really bad, and so on. But you have to accept the fact that when people from the prevention side talk about 80% of that money being wasted, Walter, it's only wasted if your only goal is preventing homelessness. If you have multiple goals and you accept the multiple goals, you should be measuring whether you're succeeding in those, but it's perfectly legitimate for money to be used for multiple purposes. So I want to end by saying that there are some elements that we found. I want to list them because I don't want Donna to get in here and think she's the only one that found them. So ability to target well is really important. Elements reflecting community motivation we really found. So in the communities that were doing what we would consider the best, they had a moral or legal or both obligation to serve this population. The county councils, the state legislatures, their mayors or whatever had said, we will do this. In the case of Hennepin and Montgomery, it was like there will not be homeless families on the street, period. And so they had loaded up their motels, and then they were trying to say, what are we going to do now? We have this obligation. We're even willing to pay for it. We're backing up our motivation with money, but we aren't doing the right thing. What are we going to do? How are we going to do that? Okay, so you have to have both the obligation and the money. Money's really important. But the money also provides even more motivation to do it right because people really, or most people, many people, really don't like to spend money and feel that they're not getting their money's worth for it. Okay, then elements that maximize resources are also really important. So collaboration among public and private agencies is essential because then you don't duplicate and so on, and also you come up with very serendipitous and creative solutions. And the non-housing mainstream agencies, who have much more money than the homeless system, recognizing a housing responsibility. And then leadership is absolutely essential. This does not happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen with somebody not being in charge of it. Somebody has to call the meetings. Somebody has to keep track of progress. Somebody has to, kick ass when absolutely necessary. Somebody has to develop a strategy. Somebody has to recognize when things have gotten off track, etc. A group mind does not do this. I don't care how collaborative, how wonderful you think your relationships are. You all have primary jobs. And it has to be somebody's primary job to make this happen. There also has to be a mechanism for feedback so that you know that things are going wrong or going right. And so you can take it to people and say, oops, wait a minute, there's a bottleneck here, there's a slip here, we're not getting as many people through here, what's going on, what should we do about it? And another thing which Hennepin County does, which I think is really wonderful, since they do know what they want, and they're absolutely explicit in their RFPs about what they're buying, is that they do performance-based contracting. And I don't mean services, I mean outcomes. So it's not just performance-based, it's outcome-based. So it's what they put out is, I want an agency that will move 4 homeless families out of shelter a month and keep them housed for a year, period. Here's the money, do it. Don't ask me how to do it. Don't ask me how many units of service. I don't even want to hear about units of service. I want to know that those families moved out and they stayed out. And they stayed stable. That's all I want to know. So if you can do all those things, I think you'll be in great shape. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. So now we'll turn to the other study. And it's with great pleasure that I'm going to now will introduce Donna Haig-Friedman. Donna is the evaluator for our homelessness prevention initiative, and it's really been a great pleasure to work with her. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She's the director of the Center for Social Policy at UMass Boston and a research associate professor in the university's McCormick Graduate School of Policy Studies. Her research focuses on system change to address social and economic inequities that impact low-income households in Massachusetts. She's the author of Parenting in Public, Family Shelter, and Public Assistance, published in 2000. And this morning she will be talking about some findings from her study on homelessness prevention. Donna.
Technical thing first. My IT buddies at work would be proud of me, right? Let me just say, thank you, Terry, and it's wonderful to be here and to follow Marty, who is a hero of mine in terms of all of that she's contributed to the country's understanding of homelessness and solving homelessness. I am representing an evaluation team, too, that I want to share with you. The findings come from our work as a team, and thank you to all of you who are here from the team. What I want to do is share with you some of the findings of the scan that we did of community-wide homeless prevention efforts that are ongoing across the United States, some different from the ones that Marty looked at, as well as in the state of Massachusetts. And you can see that the title of my presentation is Preventing Homelessness, Success and Replication. The lens that I'm bringing to this presentation is what is it that we can learn that has to do with replication here in Massachusetts. There's a lot of forces are in place now to make some, I think, wonderful system changes. So I'm bringing replication to my remarks and ways of thinking about the findings from what we've learned. What I want to start with, I'm going to make three main points. One is I want to share something about the context, the extent of economic hardship in Massachusetts that we are up against, that households are up against, and a replication framework that I hope you will hold in your heads as I walk through some of the key learnings from across the 6 communities that we looked at. And then I want to bring back that replication framework and pose some questions to you and to the panel to consider as you think about what we've learned as key lessons from these other communities that have to do with what we might adopt or adapt here in Massachusetts. If you look at the Massachusetts context in terms of the extent of economic hardship, we have a huge challenge in front of us. In terms of, based upon some other work that we're doing at the center, in terms of families in Massachusetts with incomes lower than 200% of the federal poverty line, and which is a kind of standard for low income or the self-sufficiency benchmark, and is $29,360 for a family of 3. 20% of all Massachusetts families have incomes that are at or below that benchmark. 25% of all people in Massachusetts have that income or less. 30% of all Massachusetts children. 58% of all female-headed households. And as of the year 2000, there's disproportionate hardship, economic hardship for Latino families and for African American families. The median wage in the year 2003 in Massachusetts is $16.67. That means that 50% of all workers in Massachusetts earn $16.67 or less. And if you know what the cost of living here in Massachusetts is, you understand that that means that there are a lot of our workers who are suffering an economic hardship and who have the potential to be homeless or to be in unstable housing. The recent coverage in the Globe of the mortgage foreclosures and the increased extent of mortgage foreclosures is another example of that situation for Massachusetts households. So the bottom line is, when we're thinking about prevention, we really need to think about the whole population of people here in Massachusetts. And we can't assume that the targeted primary prevention or secondary prevention efforts that we undertake are going to do it all by themselves. There has to be as Paul Grogan said in the very beginning, the efforts to increase housing that is affordable to households has to be a huge effort and is part of this big picture, and enabling families and households to increase their incomes, the income adequacy, the workforce development, all the other efforts that will enable people to increase their incomes is a part of this big picture. The racial and ethnic disparities also need to be addressed. What I know about all of us who are here today, and let me just say these PowerPoint presentation, this is in your packets. You're welcome to take a look at it. No need to be copying, making notes. I know from knowing many of you who are here that what we have in common is a wish to transform our system from one that is heavily oriented toward emergency shelter and long stays in shelter to one that is focused on preventing people from losing their housing to start with and enabling people to get out of shelter as quickly as possible and to be connected with mainstream non-residential services in the community. So that is our common ground. All right, here's a kind of replication framework to think about as I tell you something about the 6 communities that we studied. Think about, should replication take place, and what aspects of the models that I'm going to share with you are the aspects that ought to be replicated? What are the minimally essential elements that need to be replicated or adapted? What are the forces that are necessary for the replication to be successful, and are they present? Or where are the pockets of readiness that would actually make a replication successful? And how might innovations be spread? There are many answers to each of these questions, so please keep these in mind as I go through sharing some of the findings. What the lens that our team used to identify communities to take a look at was we were looking for, we had 3 lenses. One was geography. We were looking for a community-wide effort that covered a whole region, a state, a county, or a city. An effort that was beyond an individual organization effort, but that was demonstrated cross-organizational pooling of resources and decision-making processes. In taking a look at those communities across the country, we collaborated with, as Marty said, stayed away from the ones pretty much that she was handling, and identified 6 communities: Cape Cod, Massachusetts, right here in our very own backyard; Columbus, Franklin County, Ohio; the state of Minnesota; New York City, New York; Washington, D.C., and Worcester, Massachusetts. For all of these communities, there was the primary goals were to reduce the needs for and costs of shelter and to reduce the human and social costs of homelessness. All of them had those goals in common. Now, what I'm going to do, because you have the report, I'm not going to go in depth into each community. What I've tried to pull out are the minimal critical elements across the communities that look to me to be the ones that we need to think about in terms of replication and various ways of replicating. Leadership and local lead agency. There are many ways in which leadership has been demonstrated in these communities. At the local level, on the Cape, for example, there was a charismatic person who stepped up to the plate at a point in time and mobilized a community to say, it is not okay that people in our community are homeless, and mobilized an effort that then cut across many various sectors in the community, all the different sectors. And that leadership has been sustained over time. You will hear a little bit about that from Allison Rice on the panel shortly. I want to give you another example of leadership. I think the state of Minnesota presents an interesting model of leadership because the governor and the legislature and advocates and service providers got on the same page about over 10 years ago to have something different happen in Minnesota with respect to homelessness. And from an RFP was created that had certain elements in it that as you heard Marty talk about, Hennepin County has taken off with that model, and Hennepin County started it. So there was a pocket of kind of excellence and innovation going there that then the state, both the governor and the legislature, picked up on. In each of the communities, there is a local lead agency who has a responsibility for enabling the agencies to pool resources and from both the private and nonprofit and business and faith-based community and government sectors, who is a facilitator of planning and who is a convener, and in terms of building the organizational structures for the collaboration. A flexible use of resources pooled from public and other privately generated resources. Every single community has some way in which they're bringing resources from many different places, public and private, and there is a certain level of flexibility in figuring out what to give to whom, both in cash and non-cash housing-related assistance. Just to give you a few examples, on the Cape, the Homeless Assistance Corporation, Housing Assistance Corporation, brings, as I mentioned, many different sectors to the table. And because they've got funds that are publicly, from the public funds as well as private, when families or households need this resource or that resource, if there's an eligibility requirement that prevents a household from receiving the public resource, that's where the private resources are used to fill in the gaps. That is the same in Worcester, and I think it's one of the ways of thinking about this issue of targeting. If public resources are targeted very, very specifically to a very narrowly defined population, if the other players are at the table and other resources are brought to bear, there may be households who can benefit from resources, but not necessarily the public ones, but could be benefited by other private resources. Prevention supports. The kinds of prevention supports that every community provides are cash assistance and non-cash assistance, housing-related support, and then brokering connections to other supports and services. Those are the consistent components. In every community, there's effective cross-sector partnerships. I can't emphasize that more or too much. They're the faith-based organizations, businesses, public, the community public, and the public resources and nonprofits have figured out ways to have ongoing partnerships and vehicles for those partnerships to make a difference over time. In every community, the public resources are a base, and the private resources are supplemental. And I just want to emphasize that there is no way that a community-wide homeless prevention initiative is going to work without the infusion of public resources in terms of housing assistance and the cash assistance and the other supports and services that are needed. The private sector, businesses, and faith-based organizations cannot be the base. They can be supplemental, but they cannot be the base. In all of the non-Massachusetts communities, there was a coordination of prevention and shelter decision-making processes, which Marty raised in her presentation, and I think this is really important. I want to describe that for you a little bit. In Washington, D.C., for example, although the actual prevention work is happening in 8 family support collaboratives that were existing structures before the prevention program got into place, there is a centralized screening and assessment process that enables those households households who are seeking shelter to be screened prior to actually going into shelter and to be screened for the prevention initiative, the prevention resource. In Washington, if a family chooses that resource, then they are then not eligible for shelter for 12 months. So it's a real choice on the family's part. In Washington, D.C., the targeting that they have done is that the prevention resource is available to families whose incomes are high enough to be able to maintain themselves in their housing. They're not paying more than 50% of their income for housing, and they look to be able to be stable in housing for at least within a short period of time with the assistance. And they receive intensive case management. There's a very stringent contract with the families. That's the way Washington does it. In New York City, which is an initiative that is just beginning. It just started about a year ago. The city, through the mayor's office, identified $2 million per community district, 6 districts, each year for the next 3 years for prevention, homelessness prevention. And what they did was put out an RFP. They targeted to the high-need communities, and the communities have a lot of say about who is eligible for that prevention service and intervention. But the city, the centralized aspect of the administering organization is developing a way to actually create control communities so that there's a control sample. But they're also planning a feedback loop with the local community with respect to families who then go into shelter. So it's not a coordinated screening and assessment, but it's a feedback loop to the community agencies who are trying to implement shelter prevention, and to give them some sense about the extent to which families in their community are showing up in shelter. The Minnesota group, you heard from Marty what the Hennepin County approach is, and I think that issue of separating out the prevention and shelter, the rapid rehousing from shelter, is something that we ought to be thinking about. Cross-organizational outcome measurement is another strategy that all of the 4 communities who are non-Massachusetts communities did try to build in, and have used performance benchmarks to consider whether or not to keep prevention grants going with nonprofits. All the communities with outcome data show some solid evidence of success. However, no community has follow-up data beyond a 12-month post-intervention, and some of the follow-up data that are used to assess success only go out 3 months post-intervention. In Columbus, for example, that's one of the communities. So the follow-up data is not that far out for most of the communities. Okay, let me just quickly focus in on replication. Some questions to think about in terms of replication. Is there evidence of success? Is the theory of change clear? That is it clear what are the key components that lead to key kinds of outcomes? Is there a clear targeting approach that makes sense given what's known about successful approaches? And is there a way to consistently apply the key program components in other communities other than the ones in which the innovation has begun? What should be replicated? There are many, many ways to think about what could be replicated. You could replicate the organizational structure and processes. For example, the Minnesota or the New York models, where there's a lot of local autonomy, where there are performance benchmarks, where there's a high level of public resources, mandatory local advisory group, and RFP processes. Those kinds of structures and processes could be replicated, and we should think about whether or not that's the way to go here. There could be programs that are replicated. There may be, and I've given a couple here, the local lead agency and cross-sector partnerships is an aspect of prevention. Is that what we want to replicate, that program level? There are some HPI, Homeless Prevention Initiative, models that, for example, the Mass Coalition for the Homeless is linked up with health centers. Is that a program that ought to be replicated across all the health centers in the state. That's another way of thinking about replication. Should we be replicating guiding principles? And the guiding principles being that we gradually shift from emergency shelter to prevention, and with some values and indicators laid out. What are the forces necessary for replication success? As I totally agree with Marty from what we've learned, leadership, a clear collective picture of the desired systems change, a readiness for systems change, and maybe there are pockets of readiness. It may not be that there's a readiness everywhere, but where are the pockets of readiness? The cross-sector partnerships and an adequate level of resources. How might the innovation be spread? Dissemination of best practices, which is what we are doing today. That's the loosest approach for spreading innovations. Another would be affiliation processes where there are structured learning networks across that are set up perhaps by the foundations to enable communities to learn from each other about how to do this. Or a more intense way to do this, which would be centralized coordination, more like the model that Minnesota or New York is doing. And I want to end on a hopeful note. I think that the possibilities are endless, and that we are ready. I think of us as being ready as a community to take some important first steps that can be powerful ones. And I'm thinking that a community garden metaphor really fits. I've used this one other time, and it's sticking with me. In a community garden, the metaphor I want to make is that local communities, I think, ought to be the ones gathering and arranging the plants in ways that will be successful, given the unique local context and environmental conditions. That I see the state and federal government as being the rain and the sun that this garden will not grow without. And philanthropy being the ones to plant and incubate the seeds of innovation and release timed release of nutrients into the soil, and advocates to watch out for the weeds. And all of the partners there that are in this community garden metaphor, I think, are really important. We couldn't make change without all of us there. So I'm interested in hearing what you all think based on all of what Marty and I have shared and what you think is possible here in Massachusetts and in our shared vision for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Marty, for setting the stage for the next part of our discussion. We're going to turn now to the panel discussion, and I'd like to ask the members of the panel to come up and sit down. And while that happens, I know they're going to try to spend a couple of minutes just getting the screen out of the way. Sure.
Okay. In your packets is the table, and it is called Table 1.1, Prevention, Homeless Prevention Activities. This is an array of activities that are sort of gleaned from a random sample of very random, as in you could Google them and they came up, of 2004 continuum care applications. And what I really want to do is point out that the ones that Donna has listed as activities are indeed the most frequently mentioned activities, the first 4 rows of this table. But the bottom, the next category, the less commonly offered ones, are the really tough ones for the really chronic populations. They include actual housing, long-term supportive services, and so on. So, and then actually some continuums are intuitive enough that they actually list long-term prevention strategies of basic anti-poverty measures, which I think are, as Donna mentioned, really important. That this cannot be wait for the crisis and deal with it sort of thing, because the fundamental issue is there's not enough housing that poor people can afford. So they have to get less poor, and the housing has to become more affordable. But I did want to indicate that, especially for the kind of prevention that is the deinstitutionalizing issues from prisons, from mental hospitals, and so on for people with disabilities who you aren't going to expect to go to work and you aren't going to expect to be able to afford their own housing or maintain themselves in housing without help. That's the kind of prevention that another whole set of people are looking at. That's different from the short-term pick the best of the worst. This is pick the worst of the worst and recognize that they're never going to make it on their own, and what are we going to do about them? That's a whole other issue of preventing homelessness.
Thank you. Okay, would you like to come up and join us? And is Representative Honan here as well? Oh, okay, fine. All right. Well, let me begin. Yes, Representative Honan, why don't you come join us up here on the stage? Great. What I'd like to do is to introduce the moderator of the panel, who then will guide the discussion of the group. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce Commissioner Wagner. I remember meeting Commissioner Wagner about 2 years ago. I think it was about at least 2 years ago, when Cindy Rizzo and I went over to his office and said, you know, we've done a little bit of grant making in the area of homelessness prevention, and we'd really like to try out a, you know, kind of a bigger strategy, but we'd love to work with you on this process. And I think it's really wonderful that we've gotten this far. We're about halfway through the initiative, and it's just a lot of learning that's coming out of the work. Let me just tell you a little bit about Commissioner Wagner. He was appointed DTA Commissioner in April 2002. He has focused on 3 priorities while he's been in office. He's increasing access to the food stamp program. We've certainly seen a great progress in that area. Redesigning services and programs for the homeless. Under his leadership, we're no longer using motels in Massachusetts to house families, and crafting welfare reforms that will replace the current state program when the Commonwealth's welfare waiver expires in 2005. In September 2004, Secretary Preston named Commissioner Wagner the Assistant Secretary for Children, Youth, and Families. So in addition to being the DTA Commissioner, he is charged with coordinating all policies for children and families across Massachusetts' health and human services system, not a small task. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Terry. First of all, before we kick off the panel conversation, I want to publicly thank the Boston Foundation, Paul Grogan, Cindy Rizzo, and Terry Lane, who have put together in collaboration with CSP Tech this panel today. I think it's a really important conversation we're having, and to see the attendance and the caliber of the speakers, current speaker excluded, is very heartening to see the dedication to this issue. So a lot of good comments have been made, and I appreciate the forum. The second point I'd like to make before kicking this off is the Department of Transitional Assistance is the state's welfare agency. We have a budget of just over $1 billion every year. We administer, in addition to all the cash assistance programs, we administer 2 systems for homelessness, one serving homeless individuals, the other serving homeless families. So that puts in perspective some of the comments that I want to make on those systems. I really appreciated also listening to Donna Haig-Friedman and Marty Burt's comments around some of their research for a couple of reasons. One is I think it was refreshing to hear some of the themes and issues they identified as elements we've learned in Massachusetts. Whether or not they've been highlighted or not through our efforts, it's refreshing to know and to have some of those issues resonate with some of the initiatives we've undertaken in the Commonwealth. There's also, the second reason is because there are also a lot of good ideas to take back to the agency as we continue to look at better ways to end the tragedy of homelessness. And so maybe we can call this legitimate larceny and say that as we share these ideas and copy what other states and counties have done around the country, we're very, as an agency, DTA is very open to learning from others to address this issue. So, having said that, I am going to kick off the panel with a few comments, and my comments, when I was thinking of this panel last night and when I was going to say, I started to write down about some of the lessons that I think DTA has learned over the last 2 years. Over the last 24-plus months, the department has looked at the homeless systems that we oversee, that we administer, and tried to figure out ways to redefine what it means to be homeless in Massachusetts. We've made what I believe is a lot of progress, especially in the family front, and we're moving forward on the individual front as well. And so these comments are derived from the various pilots that have been alluded to or mentioned by the earlier speakers. And some things I'd like to share with you, some of which are a different kind of angle, although they might not be as eloquent as our two speakers before, a different angle of a very similar theme, and others might be a new kind of lesson, since I'm representing a state agency, which I think bears its own kind of unique role in this whole issue on how it's managed. The first lesson I think we've learned, and one that really is important for all of us to remember, is that homeless people are no different than us. They're motivated like us. They want to better their situation. They want to better the lives of their children. They want to better their own life. And we figure out how to navigate systems to do that. I don't care how much money we have, whether we do it through the tax system or any kind of other system, we all respond to the systems, and including government systems, that are there to provide benefits. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because to reinforce the fact that this is human nature and a human issue, but it also is important because we do not want to construct systems that build in perverse incentives or cause people to go into a worse state in order to get out of that state. And that's a very, very difficult nut to crack, a very difficult juggling act when you're trying to target and trying to help people who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum. Second thing that came to mind, or the second kind of lesson, is that it's, I think, important, and today is indicative of this. There is tremendous synergy around this issue. And what really hit me on this point was a couple weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to be called by the United States Interagency Council and join one other state and the federal U.S. Interagency Council in a multinational conference up in Canada. And we went up to Toronto and talked about the issues facing the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Scotland, on how to coordinate across systems, the whole notion of interagency collaboration. And while I was part of that conversation, the next day I flew back to Boston, and I had a opportunity to meet with the South Shore Interagency Council, which is located in Quincy. And so the next morning I was speaking to that group, and it was unbelievable that all of the comments from the participants were nearly identical. Whether it was Scotland talking to Germany or England, or the United States and Canada, or it was providers in Quincy, Massachusetts. The issues were, how do we leverage each other's resources? How do we collaborate? How do we combat this issue more through integration and collaboration and working together, versus the separate funding streams and programs and resources that the system kind of has inherited to deal with this issue? So that, I think, is illustrative of the synergy on this issue. The third comment that I'd like to put out there is this notion of the public's tolerance of homelessness. And by this I mean, I've heard people often say this is an abomination. We've never had homelessness in this country until the 1980s, and it's a problem, and a growing problem, and it's one we've got to resolve. And I don't disagree with any of that. But I think it belies the history if you look back at what were considered appropriate housing options for people. And we may consider now that many of these housing options are subpar. I'm not arguing that. But the history of this country is that people doubled up. People lived in tenement houses. People were in crowded situations. They lived with families and friends. And we're facing that now, and I think the tolerance of homelessness is a little different. The environment is different. And I'm not arguing this, that we should be doing this. I'm just acknowledging that this is an ongoing historical issue that this country has been faced with. And I think our tolerance of subpar housing today is less. And it's not to diminish the challenges we're facing or the lack of affordable housing, but I think it's important to acknowledge this is a long-term historical issue in this country. The fourth lesson is of the department, if I could offer one of the lessons of constructing our pilots, is that the whole issue of homelessness is very overwhelming. And when you sit down and you talk to people, including DTA staff, and say we've got to resolve this issue, it can very quickly lead to an inordinate amount of frustration and being overwhelmed and not being able to tackle the issue. And the way I think we need to address that is to chip away at what we can do to improve the system. And I think through some of the pilots, we've implemented about 6 or 8 different pilots in our sheltering systems. I think we can chip away at some of the real visible problems in the current system to keep the momentum going so that we can tackle the issue on a much broader perspective. It's very easy to get overwhelmed in the beginning. The issue is to keep making progress and movement. I think the fifth lesson is that no one has all the answers. Our speaker said this earlier. Donna Haig-Friedman mentioned, the community garden. Government can't do this alone. The public sector can't do this alone. And I truly believe that if we're going to continue our success in this effort, it's only going to be through collaboration. The sixth lesson from our pilots is that case management is key. I think an extension of that is assessments are vitally important. We as a state have not historically done that very well, and we're making efforts to augment both assessments and case management. And I think it's related to my earlier comment that homelessness is spread across a variety, or the resources to deal with homelessness are spread across a variety of programs and government levels and agencies, and it's very difficult to navigate the system, which really heightens the need for case management and look at the holistic approach to managing this issue. And it does not mean that everyone needs high-end, intensive case management services, but it does acknowledge that the system serving families coming into shelter is very complex to navigate. The seventh lesson, we have to do, I believe we have to have more faith in the families we're serving, and we need to allow them to fail. I think that's very important. It doesn't mean that we don't provide an ultimate safety net for those who fail, but we need to take risks. Not inordinate risks, not risks that put people in danger, but a perfect example of this is when we got out of the hotel business, we saved millions of dollars a year in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we were looking to reinvest that to improve the system. What we ultimately did is we created something called shelter-to-housing vouchers, and we gave families we gave our providers $6,000 to take a family out of shelter and put them into a private apartment for a year. And when we began to look at that, it was something we had never done before. It was incredibly risky, and there were some people arguing that we shouldn't do it because of the chance of failure. 207 families moved out of our sheltering system. 207 families were housed for a minimum of 11 months, and we're looking at these families. Many do have ongoing issues we need to continue to work with and address. But now all of those families have some kind of a rental history, which is a huge issue when you're coming out of shelter. I think the notion of lead agency or single point of contact is key in moving forward. For the reasons I said earlier, this is a complex. There are funding streams coming from HUD to continuums of care. There's 22 of them in Massachusetts. There's regional nonprofits. There's the DTA network. There's the DHCD network. There's philanthropies. There are faith-based entities. We need to be able to, at the local level, bring those resources together and foster collaboration rather than try to dictate how it should all be done in one centralized state way. The ninth lesson I would ask is, for consideration and just throw out, is DTA in our system, our sheltering system that serves homeless families, there's about $70 million, a little bit over, to provide shelter. And we are constantly in the difficult position of trying to shift away from a reliance on deep shelter into emergency shelter into more prevention. That is very difficult for us to do when we are also required to make sure that those shelters are open and the ultimate safety net is there. And so if you have one funding stream dedicated both towards the ultimate safety net and prevention, as a public manager, I see that as a very, very difficult way to set up and focus on prevention, because you will also and always want to make sure that the safety net is available. And the final issue is that I think we all need to work to diminish the distrust that hits this issue. We're constantly looking at, state versus federal, public versus private, DTA versus advocates, family versus individuals, housing versus homelessness, and in the end, the family suffers or the individual suffers. And we all have a part of this. We all need to figure out better ways to diminish the distrust to better serve the families. So I think those are some lessons. We've got a lot of things that we've learned from the pilots we've implemented in Massachusetts through DTA, and we look forward to building on those and the lessons that we're taking from this conference here today. So with that, I'd like to also turn it over to our other panel speakers, the first of whom is Kevin Honan. And Representative Honan, I do know that there is a DTA employee that's a constituent of yours in the audience here today. In fact, she serves on your ward committee, she told me. So we appreciate the support of the agency. Yeah, exactly. Representative Honan represents the 17th Suffolk District. And I apologize, I'm going to read the brief bio. I've just got these this morning, so I will go through this briefly. He began his career in public service at the Action for Boston Community Development. He coordinated the summer youth employment program for Alston and Brighton children and educated low-income and elderly residents on weatherization techniques and fuel assistance programs. Under former Mayor Ray Flynn, Representative Honan continued his public service in the Boston Parks and Recreation Department. In 1987, Representative Honan began his legislative service as a member of the Committee on Human Services and Elderly Affairs and as a member of the Subcommittee on Foster Care, on which he still serves today. He has worked to protect the interests of such vulnerable groups as the elderly, children, and the disabled. He was named Chairman of the Housing and Urban Development Committee in 2003. Representative Honan.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. And I want to thank Donna and Marty for your wonderful presentations at the outset, and you as well, Commissioner. I think I would like to begin by continuing on that metaphor of Donna's. If she said that the state and the federal government were the sun and the rain, the federal government would have to be the rain, and the state government and the commission would be the sun. But one thing that I, as housing chair, have discovered in traveling around the state, you have to remember the clouds, too. And when we're trying to place housing in various communities across the state, that would be the community groups that show up to oppose affordable housing. So you can't forget the clouds. They're all over the place. I want to thank Paul Grogan for his leadership on affordable housing in Massachusetts. I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with Paul on Chapter 40R, which is the Smart Growth in Massachusetts, the Smart Growth Plan. As we traveled around the state on the Housing Committee across eastern Massachusetts, we experienced a great deal of opposition to affordable housing, primarily density. People do not like dense housing, and as you know, when you have a 30,000 unit deficit, which we have here in Massachusetts, the only way to address that is to build more denser housing. But we also ran into fire commissioners who would show up to meetings and say, we can't guarantee the safety if you bring more people in. We don't have the firefighters to put the fires out if there's more housing. We had a school superintendent show up who didn't want more school children, and we have read recently in the papers, developers sometimes, when they go into communities to build housing, they say that children are treated like toxic waste, whatever, toxins. And that's the case. There's just a lot of opposition to housing around Massachusetts, and it was rather shocking for us. And when we do these types of housing, 40B, which is the Commonwealth's anti-snob zoning, there are, so we call it the anti-snob zoning law, which started in 1969, is responsible for about 40,000 units of housing in Massachusetts. We tried, of course, to protect this, but there are set-asides in there for people who are low income. Primarily, the number here is 80% of the median income, but it's also 30% because a lot of the rental units under 40B have Section 8 certificates. I wanted to point out two numbers. I always find certain statistics shocking. The Department of Housing and Community Development has 18,000 Section 8 housing choice vouchers, but has 56,000 families on a waiting list. And then, on the area of public housing, 50,000 state-assisted public housing units in Massachusetts, 50,000 which are in jeopardy. Some are falling apart, so they come to the state, the housing authority organizations in desperate need of more housing. 50,000 units, and there's 110,000 families and individuals on a waiting list. That's an extraordinary number, and it's incumbent upon Ann Paulson, myself. I think Byron Rushing is still here. Byron, I wanted to point out that Byron has filed legislation to set up a committee to end homelessness in Massachusetts. He's one of our champions in the legislature. Sal DeMacy has always been a champion on this issue as well, so I think he, being the Speaker of the House now, will be very helpful. Liz Malia has been a champion from Jamaica Plain, and Ann Paulson also. I think up at the State House there's a whole myriad of issues that we're all concerned about and we all fight for, and this is one of the problems with homelessness. It's in competition with other issues, health care, education, transportation, and Ann has been a champion, and I know she'll get into some of the specific line items, but at Democratic caucuses and in the legislature during the budget process, we go in the back room with the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and Ann has been extraordinary in holding the legislators' feet to the fire on many of the accounts that are critically important to people who are homeless, people who are in shelters, who need first and last month rent to come out, and security deposits. And she's been a leader in the legislature on that issue. I want to point that out. My aide, Jim McGlynn, is here, and Tom Plissick, they're over here. They're also terrific. So I wanted to talk just a minute. We recently put out a $200 million bond authorization in the Housing Committee, and that's something that is critically important to address this issue in the housing crisis in Massachusetts. So the money would go to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and the Housing Stabilization Fund. And to me, it's really about putting resources into these programs, and it is also about building community support. Gail, who is from Alston Brighton, handles your account at Critton and Hastings House. This is a house pregnant teenage mothers and mothers a little older, and they have an education program, their job training program, and it has community support. And I find that it's really important to have community support for these programs, and I think that was something Donna was talking about. And when we were in Brookline, the Pine Street Inn did a single-room occupancy over there on Beacon Street. Very, very encouraging to see all of the neighborhood support. In my neighborhood, we have a community development corporation that has neighborhood residents on the board and business leaders from the community. And whenever there's an issue down at the Zoning Board of Appeal to turn a factory, it might be an old sneaker factory, other types of factories, into housing, there's always community support. So I would urge you in your communities, whenever there's an issue before the Zoning Board, to write a letter of support. There are fights all across Massachusetts at the Zoning Board that are just very disheartening, and in order for us to get out of this housing crisis, we need more housing built, and that will help people in all sectors of the economy. So I would urge you to go out and support housing initiatives in your communities and join CDC boards, because I find those to be really, really important. That's it for now. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Representative Honan. I agree. Representative Paulson has been a great champion of the families and individuals served by the department. And she's the state representative for the 24th Middlesex District. She's a member of the legislature's Committee on Transportation, as well as the Committee on Children and Families and the Committee on Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development. She is currently serving her 7th two-year term. Representative Paulson has served as the co-chair of the Massachusetts Caucus of Women Legislators and the co-chair of the Progressive Legislators Group. Her legislative work has emphasized better education and training for women on welfare, as well as other comprehensive supports to help them move out of poverty. She is also a strong advocate for elderly home care services, public education, affordable housing, and promoting a healthy environment. Representative Paulson.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being invited to participate on this panel today, and it's always a pleasure to share a conversation with Commissioner Wagner, who has taken the housing issue very seriously in his years as commissioner and has worked hard to shut down that motel and hotel program, which I think we all hated very much. So we appreciate that, and also to Kevin Honan, who, of course, has worked very hard on the thorny issue of affordable housing. And I will say that my community in Belmont is a difficult nut to crack, although we opened up 4 units of affordable housing yesterday morning, and brand new housing. The town donated $1 million worth of town property, and we have built 4 that opened up yesterday, and 2 more will open up in a couple of months, being built by the Habitat for Humanity. And there are 2 other projects, one hopefully in one of the closed down Catholic churches, that we hope to be able to push forward on. So I think we are making progress. It's not in the thousands, but it is house by house. And I'll be happy to hear from Allison Rice and learn more about what happened at what happens on Cape Cod and the ways that they prevent homelessness. And I also have to give a little applaud to my constituent Mary Doyle from the Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership, who although I thought I knew a lot about what had happened in the budget, she got an emergency phone call last night about 8 o'clock to fill in a couple of the details that I had forgotten or never paid attention to. So I'm just going to briefly describe some programs that were funded or have not been funded in the state budget this year, and ones that I think will be helpful in preventing homelessness. Very small steps forward again, but nevertheless, we're moving forward on the issue. And I think for the first time in many years, the state legislature is really thinking about the prevention model as well as the sheltering model. So the first is RAFT, which is Rental Assistance for Families in Transition. This is a one-time subsidy of up to $3,000 to a family that's in danger of losing housing, or else to help them obtain housing. It can be used for rent arrearages, utility payments, first and last month's rent. There are strict parameters around this program, and families paying more than 50% of their monthly income on rent are not eligible for this subsidy because it's feared that we are only postponing homelessness by a month or two. And when rental assistance is used in this program, it's important that it be used to stabilize families, not just to keep them for 1 month from falling off the cliff. In fiscal year 06, after much discussion, the House appropriated $3 million and the Senate has appropriated $5 million with language that is really more flexible than what was in the House budget. And the conference committee is continuing to work diligently, and we're hoping it will come out, the budget will be released soon, and that the RAFT program will be the recipient of more than the House budget. Last year, the RAFT was in the budget for $2 million, and it was a pilot program, and so many people were assisted through that program that it ran out of money after 6 months. So we know that it can be successful, and there are statistics that show that those people have not become homeless, and so it's it's a good program, and I'm hoping that we will be able to continue it effectively. The second is the ISSE program, which is the Individual Self-Sufficiency Initiative, and this is the program that has not been funded in the state budget. It used to be in the state budget. When we got into the budget crisis, it dropped away. It was zeroed out, and it has been used primarily for low-income working individuals who also find themselves with a housing crisis. Once again, the small subsidies that are given to these individuals have prevented them from becoming homeless. Frequently, people eat at shelters, they work, they have very modest salaries, and so they get into a financial difficulty, either a health problem or a rental arrearage or else a utility issue, and they just can't get over that hump and get themselves back on their feet. So again, these one-time subsidies frequently allow people, individuals, to stay in their apartments or their single-room occupancies, whatever it is, without falling into a shelter and then trying to climb out again. I think that we all know what happens when an illness in a child or an adult prevents a person from working, when increased utility bills in cold winter deplete monthly incomes. And many of us can dig into savings accounts, or we have extended families that can step in and help us. But the population, I think, that we are helping here in Massachusetts through these programs, they have no fallback positions. And so, therefore, it is important that we have those safety nets in Massachusetts, and hopefully the success of the RAFT program will provide an impetus for us to reinvent the ISSE program, either through a supplemental budget in the fall or next year in the annual budget. And the third program is the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program. It's better known as the MRVP. In fiscal year 03, the funding was established at $26 million, and then it declined during the budget crisis. This year, both the House and the Senate have appropriated $26.2 million. The desire was for about $44 million. We're not there yet, but we're climbing up from what we were a couple of years ago. Again, to qualify for these subsidies, and I'm sure you probably all know this information better than I do, the tenants' incomes must be below 200% of the federal poverty level. And we saw up on the bullet up on the screen that amounts to about $29,000 for a family of three. So the Senate language provides, once again, more flexibility in this program. It changes the flat rate subsidy, which forced many families that in the high rent market to pay up to 70% of their income on rent. The new language in the Senate, which we're hopeful will be in the final budget, provides that tenants will pay 35% of their incomes, and the MRVP will then fill in the gap between what they pay and what the cost of the unit is. That's the only way that we can really allow people to stay in those houses and feed their children and buy them shoes to go to school. The fourth program that I'm going to talk about is the Consumer Education Center, that is part of the regional nonprofit agencies that administer the housing programs. There are 8 regional agencies across the state. We're in the catchment area of the Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership. The Consumer Education Centers, which we're hopeful will be funded at $1 million this year, provide a front door through which people can enter to solve their housing problems, sometimes through mediation, or they can access information about housing opportunities and availability. The regional agencies administer the subsidy programs, and the MBHP, which is our regional agency here, oversees 7,000 tenants and also deals with 4,000 landlords. So it's a very highly effective organization that really works closely with DHCD to make sure that the people are well served. Combined, these programs cost the state, and the Department of Mental Health also has some programs in which they help to provide housing for people with mental illness. And Joe Finn, who's here, just told me that they're moving ahead with expanding that program so that people with mental health issues will also find more housing. Combined, these programs have cost the state less than $35 million. but they keep individuals and families out of shelter and in stable housing. Hopefully, just as DTA has been able to redirect money used for the hotel and motel housing, we will be able to prevent enough entries into homeless shelters and be able to redirect some of the $100 million we spend in Massachusetts in the shelter accounts into permanent housing opportunities. Before I close, I would just like to say that I feel that we've had a lot of discussion about ways in which we have to provide supports for people, but we also need to think of housing as not a single dimension, but rather needs to be affected by many other issues that the legislature deals with and that citizens deal with. And so I'll just list a few of them. One would be raising the minimum wage, so that because when we raise the minimum wage, it means that all wages are elevated, and certainly the 58% of women who are living below the poverty level and trying to raise their children, I think, would be well affected by an increase in the minimum wage. I believe we should use the profits, some of the profits, for the sale of state properties to actually be used to house people who used to live in those state properties, whether it's the mentally retarded or the mentally ill, but that a portion of that should be absolutely directed towards housing opportunities for those people. I think we need to have adequate funding for public education so that our children in Massachusetts can flourish no matter where they live. I believe that we need, and I thank the Boston Foundation for raising the issue very publicly, we need to reorganize and rethink our Corey system. We are preventing so many people from getting jobs that it's absolutely, you can't raise your children safely without a job. We need to improve our mental health treatment so that we have fewer people with mental illness who don't work. And I believe that we do need to improve and expand real education opportunities for women on public assistance. That's the only way they're ever going to raise their children out of poverty, is for them to have enough education. And we know that educated women have educated children. So that is a really important thing. I also think that we in Massachusetts need to really press on the federal government, not that they pay attention to Democratic Massachusetts, but the federal government cannot begin to withdraw its support for Section 8s. It's an impossibility. We can't survive without them here, and the West Coast and the East Coast really need to work hard to make sure that we have them. So I think we need a holistic approach, and when we embark on a holistic approach, I believe that we will be able to solve the housing issues, because we will have, people with opportunities in Massachusetts, and they will be able to live in their own stable housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Paulson. Certainly an aggressive agenda. Our next panelist is Allison Rice, and I'm fortunate to be on the panel with Allison. The department has a long-standing relationship with Allison and the Housing Assistance Corporation, which is on Cape Cod and was referenced earlier in some of the speakers' remarks. Ms. Rice began working as a housing advocate at the Community Action Committee of Cape Cod and the islands in the mid-1980s and came to HAC, or the Housing Assistance Corporation, as Director of Housing Search in 1987. Over the years, she's added sheltering and property management to her duties and now supervises 4 family sheltering programs, housing search services, stabilization and prevention programs, and the management of 40 units at HAC-controlled or HAC-owned permanent housing. Having joined the homelessness cause 20 years ago with the idea of putting herself out of a job, Allison now believes that homelessness will only end if prevention becomes the focus. Ms. Rice.
Thank you. I'm reminded of the Peanuts characters who were out on the grass looking up at the clouds, and one said, "I believe I see Beethoven in that cloud." And another one said, "I believe I see the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo's hand reaching in that cloud. Charlie Brown, what do you see?" And Charlie said, "Well, I was going to say a ducky and a horsey." And so I feel kind of like the ducky and the horsey here. And that's fine, because I do want to share at this point and thank all the wonderful people who have spoken today. I just want to say hooray, hooray, again and again. And with people like this in our legislature, we just might make it. We'll work on the federal part. Just as an aside, I heard Joe Biden threw his hat in this morning. Anyway, when Commissioner Wagner mentioned homeless people experiencing homelessness, are just like us. When people ask me who are the homeless, I tell them to look in the mirror, take away their paycheck, and most of their support system, and they're looking at it. Because those are the people that we are serving. I did hope to be out of a job in terms of homelessness, advocacy, and sheltering at this point in my life. I've only got a few years to go, so we've got to step this program up. I am convinced, absolutely, that prevention is the way, and I want to talk a little bit about how that has worked on Cape Cod in the specific, and because I do believe there's a lot of replication that can happen. We've talked about targeting and universal and primary and those kinds of things, which I really appreciate people who can think like that. That just really takes my breath away, and I had the opportunity to see your presentations before hearing your talk about them, and I just love the way that is organized, because I feel like on a day-to-day basis I'm putting out fires most of the time, and when I can look at someone else's thought process and go, hey, we can use that, that means everything, because it means fewer families will become homeless. Collaboration is Cape Cod's key to success. Our collaboration with state agencies, DTA, DHCD, and local groups. On the Cape, we really probably, maybe mostly because of our geography, and as large as the Cape is, it's really just a small town. We depend on the people who are living and working in the lower Cape to let us know what those needs are. And if you know the Cape, you know the lower is really the upper and the upper is really the lower, but that's okay. So, the Interfaith Council for the Homeless, for example, which is located in Orleans, will call our prevention department and say, I'm sending you an application regarding blah, blah, blah. Now, we have worked with the Chatham Ecumenical Council, and they're going to pay the utility bill because, people couldn't get through the winter, so on and so on. And we wanted to know if you could pay this part of the rent, and the St. Vincent de Paul Society is going to do $300. That's the way we work. And with programs like the Toolbox, which I'll talk about in a second, and RAFT, which has been mentioned before, that's what makes it work. And we can't do it without the Section 8 programs. And nobody, unfortunately, even our Democrats, have really come forward with housing as the primary issue. And with all the other issues that are out there, how can those issues be addressed if people don't have a stable place to live? How do you get employment when you can't even say, you can call me at? These are the day-to-day things that are faced by our families. In the last year and a half, we've eliminated 20 units, the need for 20 units of shelter on Cape Cod. And we have done that because of the prevention programs. And that has been enhanced, that ability has been enhanced greatly by the RAFT program that Ann spoke about and the Toolbox program, which was the follow-up to the S2H program that DTA put in place. We went from 6,000 down to 4,000. That's okay, we can go back up. But those pieces, along with our prevention money that we have had coming from DTA for the last 10 years and continues to come, and the packaging those pieces, looking at what is it going to take for this individual family to make it. You do look on the other side and say, we're not going to pay the rent if there's no way this person's going to be able to hang on to this housing. But usually we're talking about people who've had a setback. Now, many of us in this room, when we have a car repair, we're like, oh, not that. But we can make it. When one of our families has a car repair, that's it. There's no rent to be paid for that month. Then they got the car repair and next month's rent, and you get 2 months behind, and that's it. You can't come out of that hole without some help. So the prevention programs do that. We are out in the community. We are networking with the community. People know where to go for what. And when they come to us through the HCEC program, or whatever program they get there, but that's one of them, and we say, this is what you need to do. We're going to use the raft or the toolbox. And the toolbox piece, I think, gives us a great opportunity to make those choices that someone was speaking about earlier, shelter or prevention. The family needs to be a part of that decision. When we have asked that question, and we have in these recent months, nobody picked shelter because people don't want to get there. It's too hard to climb out of it. Okay, what are some of the things that we do in addition to the state programs? Well, let me just tell you, there is one ongoing fundraiser that absolutely everybody can do, and you won't believe how easy it is. It's called buying groceries. Anybody do that? Okay. An organization, in our case, a faith-based organization, buys $5,000 initially, $5,000 worth of the grocery certificates that you see, the grocery gift certificates that you see hanging on the little dealie at the checkout. Okay, the Dennis Yarmouth Ecumenical Council for the Prevention of Homelessness started that more than 10 years ago. They bought $5,000 worth. Then the churches sell them. We buy them, you buy them, your neighbors buy them, your friends, your acquaintances, anybody. And you go take that to the grocery store. It looks like a credit card. And you just buy your groceries. It doesn't cost you anything to do this. You can be magnanimous, and it won't cost you an extra dime. 5% of the take collected on those grocery gift certificates goes to DYEC. Now, 5% of mine, the 4 people up here, won't amount to much. But when you've got people in churches all over the Cape doing it, it means at least $3,000 or $4,000 a month coming into our private prevention program, the one that gives us all the flexibility so that even the guy who owns his own company but is going under and trying to pay his employees and losing it, we can assist that guy. Okay? I know it sounds too good to be true. You're looking at me like, now what's the catch here? And there really isn't one, except that you've got to get it going in your own community. Shaw's does it, Stop and Shop, Grand Union, A&P, they all do it. Even our local markets, our local, what do you call those stores? Yeah, like Lambert's, which is a fruit market, and things like that. Those local places are coming on board with this. So you buy your groceries and keep your neighbor housed. That's how it works. And what we are doing on the Cape, this has been running for a while, but we just keep pressing it, and that's what you'll need to do, because people won't believe this is true. And for those people that tell you they use their credit card so that they can get their frequent flyer miles, you say, well, that's just fine. Send us $5 for every 100 you spend. Does the same thing. At any rate, that is one of our biggest, easiest fundraisers, and that one can definitely be replicated. One of the things that has been mentioned here today is what I call triage. It was explained much better than I can. But, you know, when a family comes to us and they can't stay in that house, they can't afford that house, they're going to have to go into shelter. Okay, that's fine, but we need to get them out quicker, as has been discussed here. We can do that. I really believe that with collaboration, with every sector working towards prevention as the focus, that we can, certainly in my lifetime, hopefully in my career time, bring shelter down only to those who are the neediest, who need things other than economic assistance. But we can do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison. We are going slightly over our time, but we do have a few minutes for a couple questions, if there are any from the audience. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Yes, sir.
Yeah, over the last... Oh, that's good, thanks. Over the last 8 to 10 years, I made it a habit to, as I live in Winchester, but I come into Boston and Cambridge a lot, and I cross homeless people, or some of them are homeless, not all of them, on the street. And I created this little sheet, little thing to give to them that gave a list of names of places where they could get a daily meal, numbers where they could find shelter, and special numbers depending whether they were families or they were individuals or veterans that they could call for help. And the information at that time was for emergency shelters. Obviously, the game is changing. What would I change on that sheet now to give to these people as a suggestion?
Well, maybe I will give these guys some time to think about it and offer one suggestion. One would be to look at the areas in which the state is focused more on prevention. So it may very well be some of the resources offered through the 8 regional nonprofits, whether it be some of the housing education centers, or which actually can provide a clearinghouse, it's my understanding, of some of the prevention efforts or resources that are out there that may prevent their further, if they, you know, I don't know if they're in the system or not, but may prevent their situation from being worse. I would also consider the support services needed to help people whether they're in shelter or not, like you know, food stamps or other access to food, if that is likely an issue if they're outside. I think there's a variety of things you could add to that list. I don't know if anyone else wants to mention anything. There is a 211 line, which is a resource referral kind of call for, I think it's put together or staffed by the United Way, but it's almost like a one-stop shopping if you call 211 and you can ask for, you know, resources. Yes.
I just wanted to mention one thing, that I got a lot of this information from Massachusetts Coalition for the Homeless book, and maybe they upgraded their book to include some of this new stuff.
And I see them here, so that's a good question.
You raise a good question, and
we are updating the book.
There you go.
you raise a good question, and it's not something that I work on in the legislature every day. In the Housing Committee, but as I drive to work in the morning and come up Cambridge Street, I'm greeted by, as the weather has gotten better, homeless people asking for money, and when you stop at the red lights, and they're younger than usual. So
we have time for one more quick question. Yes, in the back. Oh, sorry.
Good morning. I have a question about coordination of services between other state agencies. In my program, for example, most of the people we serve will have a core issue that prevents them from accessing any housing vouchers or services, even project-based Section 8. They are basically excluded from any assistance. In some cases, this affects families and children as well. I just wanted to ask the Commissioner if there is any coordination between the Department of Transitional Assistance, Department of Corrections, and Department of Social Services, for example, to address the issues of people who literally come out of jail with no services whatsoever, which means an amazing waste of resources. We keep these people in jail for 3, 4, 5 years, and then we throw them in the streets with no support whatsoever, and just for them to go back to jail. So I would like to know what's been done in this regard. Thank you.
It's a great question, and quite frankly, it's a very, very difficult issue for us at the Department of Transitional Assistance to manage. Increasingly, the issues of QORIs and SORIs, which is sex offender registry, is a very, very difficult challenge in housing people that come to us for shelter or are already in our sheltering system, so many of whom come out of the correctional system, as you identified. There is a group, in Massachusetts, for about a year now, we have established something called an interagency council, and it's chaired directly by the Lieutenant Governor. We have regular meetings, and corrections sits at the table, I'm at the table, other heads of state agencies are at the table in an attempt to better coordinate challenges and issues facing some of the agencies in the executive branch to make sure we're serving folks better. That is an issue that there's not an easy answer to that, and but I can assure you that those conversations are happening, and Corrections is trying to figure out a way to provide additional resources to that population, whether it be through their reentry centers that they're bringing up across the state. I think there's 8 of them. But we're also looking at the Executive Office of Public Safety. It has received a federal grant from the Center of Sexual Offenders in D.C. to coordinate a policy regarding sex offenders as well. And state agencies are beginning, there's only been one meeting, state agencies are beginning to participate in that discussion. And the goal is to come up with effective management policies across the state for those with sex offender histories or sex offenses. None of these are easy issues, and people, there aren't answers developed. But I think the key to figuring this out is better communication across our systems, and I think those are 2 examples of how that communication has begun to occur. Yes, Representative.
Thank you. I'd just like to add that I think the legislature is also picking up, I think, more seriously this year the issue of the QORIs. One of the problems with the QORIs is that they're not accurate, and people have a terribly hard and long journey to correcting that QORI report. So that's an issue that really needs to be resolved. And I think also, expunging the records of juveniles after they turn 17, especially if they're really, obviously if it's a very violent offense, that's one thing, but for nonviolent offenses, there were astounding figures given yesterday about the number of people who actually have QORI records in Massachusetts, some of whom we like and love. So I think that there was a hearing yesterday before the Judiciary Committee. I thought it was well received by the chairs, and I know that Representative Rushing is working hard and has made the reorganization of the QORI process and cleaning it up one of his priorities. I think also we really need to, as a society, rethink the minimum mandatory sentences. Unless we rethink minimum mandatory sentences, we're always going to have people who have to wrap up their jail sentence in jail, have no hope of any kind of parole or, sort of a little escape into the community to get ready to live in the community again. We're always going to have people coming out of prison with their $50 and nowhere to go. Right. So I think that there are those issues are ones that really need to be addressed, or we're not going to be able to help the people who have records.
Dr. Burt?
Yes. From the corrections point of view, Especially since you're talking about felonies, obviously, and people coming out of prison. 2/3 of those people will be back in prison in 3 years. 1/3 will be back in 1 year. And there are corrections departments around the country that have actually done the math on that, and whether they feel that they are social service agencies or not, they are recognizing payoff for themselves of doing like they used to have halfway houses, remember? They had parole, but even without parole, offering the people who obviously have nowhere to go and no way to support themselves 6 months of transitional housing and employment assistance actually pays off for corrections, and there are places that are recognizing that. It's a good financial argument.
Okay, I want to thank everyone and offer a final round of applause for all of our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For your hard work. I never knew how